In Tehran in 2025, the Islamic Republic faces a regime problem that is simultaneously institutional, coercive, and financial. Succession anxiety intensified after President Ebrahim Raisi's death in May 2024 removed a leading contender for the supreme leadership. The Parliamentary and Assembly of Experts elections of March 2024 exposed how far the regime now depends on controlled participation rather than broad consent. The Guardian Council screened candidates in advance, barred figures such as Hassan Rouhani from the assembly race, and narrowed the field before a vote the state needed as proof of legitimacy. The presidential contest that followed produced Masoud Pezeshkian, but on only about 40% turnout, the lowest of any election in the history of the Islamic Republic. By late 2025, the regime was also coping with strategic damage from conflict with Israel, economic isolation, and a visibly angrier society still shaped by the repression that followed the 2022 protest wave. What is at risk is not merely cabinet authority or electoral standing, but the continuity of the governing system itself. The Islamic Republic's ability to manage succession, distribute rents, suppress dissent, and maintain a credible chain of command. That system is often described either as a republic constrained by clerics or as a dictatorship centered on one man. Both formulations are inadequate. Iran is neither a standard constitutional republic nor a purely personal autocracy. It is a layered regime in which electoral institutions operate inside a framework of clerical supremacy, legal supervision, military guardianship, and patronage control. The Constitution places the legislature, executive, and judiciary under the supervision of the absolute leadership of the jurist, while the Assembly of Experts formally selects the leader. The Guardian Council vets both laws and elections, and the Expediency Council arbitrates deadlock under the leader's authority. The president is, in constitutional terms, the highest official after the leader, but only outside matters directly related to the office of leadership. That phrase is the hinge on which the entire hierarchy turns. It creates a republic below and a supervisory state above. The practical question, therefore, is not whether formal institutions exist. They do, and they matter. The operative question is which institutions can appoint, filter, command, punish, and fund. In Iran, those capacities are distributed unequally. The supreme leader appoints key judicial and military posts, controls the clerical half of the Guardian Council, and presides over the strategic organs that define defense and regime policy. The Revolutionary Guards, meanwhile, have become central to domestic politics, oil revenue, regional operations, and succession calculations. Candidate vetting limits electoral uncertainty. The judiciary and security apparatus police social and political defiance. Parastatal foundations and sanction evasion networks sustain elite coalitions. The result is a dual state. One side legal, electoral, and administrative, the other supervisory, coercive, and insulated from voters. To understand who really rules, one must move from constitutional theory to the revolutionary design that produced it. The ideological foundation of the Islamic Republic is Vilayat-e-Faqih, the doctrine that a qualified Islamic jurist must exercise guardianship over the political community in the absence of the hidden imam. Khomeini's innovation was not simply theological restatement, but institutional translation. In the 1970s, he argued that just government required supervision by a faqih. After the 1979 revolution, that claim became the organizing principle of the new state. The Constitution codified the Republic, but it did so inside an explicitly Islamic hierarchy. Article 5 assigns leadership during the occultation to the just and pious faqih, while Article 57 places the legislative, executive, and judicial branches under the supervision of the absolute leadership of the Ummah. The Constitution, therefore, does not juxtapose popular sovereignty and clerical authority as equal principles. It subordinates popular institutions to an overriding guardianship that can supervise, correct, and, if necessary, override them. That architecture is why elections in Iran are real, but never fully constitutive of power. At the same time, the regime has always insisted that this clerical supremacy is compatible with popular participation. Article 6 states that the affairs of the country are to be administered on the basis of public opinion expressed through elections and referenda. But Article 6 sits beside Articles 5, 57, 91, 99, 107, and 110, which collectively ensure that public opinion can function only inside a supervised field. The Assembly of Experts, elected by the people, appoints the leader. Yet the Guardian Council supervises the election of the Assembly itself. Parliament is elected, but its legislation must pass Guardian Council review for compatibility with Islam and the Constitution. The President is directly elected, but his candidacy is screened in advance, and his authority stops wherever matters directly concerned with the office of leadership begin. The Constitution thus embeds elections without permitting electoral sovereignty. It produces participation without allowing voters to alter the theological core of the regime. This contradiction has shaped Iranian politics from the beginning. The Islamic Republic gains some of the legitimacy benefits of elections, popular mobilization, and constitutional language, while preserving an unelected apex capable of containing electoral outcomes. The consequence is a system in which every contest over law, policy, and leadership is also a contest over the limits of supervision. Reformists can win office, but not redefine the regime. Conservatives can dominate the institutions of control, but not abolish the Republican facade, because elections remain a source of domestic and international legitimacy. What looks from outside like ambiguity is, in structural terms, an instrument of rule. The Constitution does not merely describe institutions. It arranges them so that the jurist's guardianship survives shifts in public mood. That arrangement becomes clearer when one examines the organs through which supervision is operationalized. The Assembly of Experts is often cited as proof that the supreme leader is not monarchic, because it is the formal body that chooses him and, in theory, may dismiss him if he no longer meets the required qualifications. Constitutionally, the task of appointing the leader is vested in the experts elected by the people, and the body is charged with ensuring that the leader remains qualified. Yet the institutional logic of the Assembly sharply limits its autonomy. It is composed of clerics, not a broad political electorate. Its candidates are themselves filtered before reaching the ballot, and the process of deliberation over succession occurs largely out of public view. The body was re-established in 1983 for the sole purpose of selecting and overseeing the leader, but in practice it has selected a leader only once after Khomeini and has never exercised meaningful public supervision over the office. The formal mechanism exists, but the gate to that mechanism is controlled elsewhere. That gate is the Guardian Council. Article 91 creates a 12-member body composed of 6 Islamic jurists selected by the leader and 6 lawyers nominated by the head of the judiciary and elected by Parliament. Because the head of the judiciary is also appointed by the leader, the supreme leader has direct influence over one half of the council and decisive indirect influence over the other. Article 99 gives the Guardian Council responsibility for supervising the elections of the Assembly of Experts, the presidency, parliament, and referenda. Article 98 gives it the power to interpret the Constitution. It is therefore not simply an upper chamber or a constitutional court. It is simultaneously a legislative reviewer, a constitutional interpreter, and a gatekeeper for political entry. Its screening of thousands of parliamentary hopefuls in 2024, qualification of only a fraction of Assembly of Experts registrants, and barring of Hassan Rouhani illustrated the practical effect. Elections are competitive only after the regime has determined who may compete. The Expediency Council completes this supervisory triangle. Article 112 empowers it to resolve deadlocks when Parliament and the Guardian Council cannot agree, and its permanent and changeable members are appointed by the leader. The presidency, even after the 1989 abolition of the prime ministership, remains subordinate to this unelected architecture. Article 113 makes the president the highest official after the leader, but specifically excludes matters directly connected to the office of leadership. The consequence is a state in which Republican institutions can govern administration, budgets, and day-to-day policy, yet cannot secure final authority over legislation, candidacy, succession, or strategic direction. Parliament can debate, presidents can campaign, and factions can alternate in office, but the critical filters remain outside electoral reach. That is why the next question is not merely how the Constitution distributes powers, but how the office of the leader converts those powers into continuous operational control. Article 110 is the core of the Iranian power structure. It authorizes the leader to delineate the general policies of the Islamic Republic, supervise their execution, command the armed forces, declare war and peace, mobilize the military, appoint the clerical jurists of the Guardian Council, appoint the supreme judicial authority, appoint the head of state broadcasting, appoint the chief of the joint staff, appoint the commander of the Revolutionary Guards, and appoint the supreme commanders of the armed forces and police. This is not symbolic headship. It is a vertically integrated command system. The leader stands above the branches of government because he controls the institutions that interpret the Constitution, police elections, shape the judiciary, monopolize broadcast media, and command organized force. The Constitution also authorizes him to resolve differences among the branches and to use the Expediency Council to solve problems that cannot be managed by conventional means. The effect is to place crisis arbitration, coercive command, and constitutional correction in the same office. Around this constitutional core developed the office of the Supreme Leader, a bureaucratic and political apparatus far more significant than the Constitution's terse language suggests. The office coordinates clerical, security, economic, and administrative channels, transmits guidance to state organs, and serves as the hub through which the leader monitors competing institutions without collapsing them into a single-party state. Its importance is visible even from outside Iran. In 2019, the United States explicitly sanctioned the Supreme Leader's office and targeted those appointed by or acting for that office. The same year, Mojtaba Khamenei was sanctioned on the grounds that he represented the leader in an official capacity despite holding no elected office. That detail matters because it reveals how power in Iran can be both formal and extra-formal at once. Influence does not require constitutional title if it is exercised through the leader's office, family gatekeeping, clerical networks, or security intermediaries. This arrangement produces a system more durable than personal dictatorship, but less transparent than ordinary constitutional government. The leader does not need to manage every ministry or legislative vote directly. He governs by appointments, supervisory organs, policy guidance, and selective intervention. The office of the Supreme Leader allows oversight without open responsibility for all failures. Elected institutions absorb public frustration, while unelected institutions retain final vetoes. The contradiction is productive for the regime. Presidents can be praised or blamed, parliaments can obstruct or comply, and the judiciary can punish or signal, but the apex remains institutionally insulated. The consequence is that elite competition persists without threatening the theological center of the state. To see how this worked in practice, one must return to the revolution itself and the years in which Khomeini and his allies built parallel institutions to secure clerical rule. The Islamic Republic was not born as a settled constitutional order. Between 1979 and 1981, it was assembled through revolutionary consolidation, institutional duplication, and selective elimination of rivals. The referendum of March 1979 established the new political form, and the constitution later that year translated Khomeini's doctrine into law. But the decisive struggle concerned not only what the constitution said, but who would control the institutions inherited from the monarchy and the revolution. Khomeini and his circle distrusted older state organs, especially the conventional military and bureaucratic apparatus, and therefore built counterweights alongside them. The Revolutionary Guards were created after the revolution as defenders of the new order and as a counterweight to the traditional armed services. Revolutionary committees, courts, and clerical bodies likewise expanded not as temporary improvisations, but as mechanisms for enforcing ideological victory over liberal, leftist, nationalist, and secular competitors. The state that emerged was dual from birth. The logic of those early institutions was clear. They did not merely administer policy. They identified enemies, distributed revolutionary legitimacy, and bypassed inherited hierarchies. This is why the revolutionary period matters so much for later Iranian politics. The guards were established outside the regular military chain, answered to the revolutionary leadership, and were conceived as protectors of the revolution against both internal subversion and external plots. The Basij, created in 1979 as the mobilization of the oppressed, supplied a mass social arm for the regime. Even before its later wartime and policing roles, the Basij embodied a principle crucial to the Islamic Republic. Coercion should not depend solely on a professional security elite, but on networks of ideological volunteers rooted in neighborhoods, schools, mosques, and provincial society. This broadened the regime's reach while blurring the boundary between state authority and mobilized loyalism. The consequence of revolutionary consolidation was that the constitution never operated in a neutral administrative environment. It rested on institutions created precisely to guard the revolution from its own electorate, from rival elites, and from inherited state structures. That early duplication, regular military beside guards, courts beside revolutionary courts, elected bodies beside clerical oversight, was not temporary redundancy. It was the operating grammar of the new regime. Formal legality and revolutionary exceptionalism would coexist, each correcting the other when necessary. By 1980, the state still contained multiple claimants to authority. By the early 1980s, clerical supremacy had largely settled the question. Yet the decisive accelerator of that settlement was not constitutional debate alone. It was war, and war transformed the Islamic Republic from a revolutionary coalition into a militarized system of enduring parallel power. The Iran-Iraq War was the great institutional forge of the Islamic Republic. What had been a revolutionary state with overlapping authorities became, through 8 years of war, a regime whose legitimacy, coercive capacity, and political memory were inseparable from militarized survival. The war elevated sacrifice, martyrdom, and endurance into governing idioms, but its most important legacy was organizational. The Revolutionary Guards expanded from a revolutionary militia into a parallel military institution with its own command structure, branches, and social prestige. The Basij became both a reservoir of manpower and a moral symbol of revolutionary devotion, notorious for human wave assaults and later integrated into domestic social control. The regular armed forces survived, but the war entrenched distrust of relying on inherited institutions alone. Coercive power would henceforth be deliberately duplicated. The Artesh would defend the state. The guards would defend the revolution. The constitutional structure made this militarization politically consequential. Because the leader assumed supreme command of the armed forces and appointed the chief commander of the Revolutionary Guards, war strengthened the link between clerical authority and military organization. Khomeini could frame battlefield command, mobilization, and political discipline as elements of a single religious political order. The Basij's growth also gave the regime a social base in poorer and more provincial constituencies, reinforcing ties between ideological loyalty and material access. In peacetime, Reuters notes, the Basij enforced Islamic social codes, act at checkpoints and in parks, and crush protests. That later role is intelligible only because wartime mobilization normalized their presence as a permanent arm of the revolutionary state. The consequence was profound. Coercion ceased to be an emergency function and became a constitutive feature of governance. War also shifted elite balance. It created commanders, martyr networks, veterans associations, procurement channels, and security careers that would later feed directly into politics, business, and regional operations. Khamenei's later reliance on the guards was rooted in this period, when military actors acquired revolutionary legitimacy that older clerical institutions alone could not supply. The war taught the regime that survival required redundancy, ideological mobilization, and a security class with both battlefield credentials and domestic functions. It also taught that extraordinary circumstances justified extraordinary institutions. By the late 1980s, however, the revolutionary founder was dying, the war was ending, and the regime had to translate wartime concentration of authority into a more stable post-Khomeini order. That translation came through constitutional revision and a decisive rebalancing of the state in 1988 to 1989. The late Khomeini period exposed the Islamic Republic's problem of governability. Legislative deadlock between parliament and the Guardian Council had become chronic, factional conflict within the ruling elite was sharpening, and the impending question of succession threatened to reopen debates about the religious qualifications and institutional design of leadership. The response was not liberalization but constitutional and administrative restructuring. In 1988, Khomeini created the Expediency Council to break deadlocks that neither Parliament nor the Guardian Council could resolve. In 1989, the constitution was revised. The post of prime minister was abolished, the powers of the presidency were expanded, and the supreme leader's position was adjusted to secure continuity after Khomeini. These changes were not cosmetic. They rationalized the dual state by reducing executive fragmentation while strengthening the unelected apex. The most consequential change concerned the qualifications for the leader. The original constitution had effectively required the highest clerical standing associated with a marja, but the 1989 revision removed that requirement, enabling Ali Khamenei, who did not possess Khomeini's rank, to assume the office. Reuters later summarized the political meaning clearly. Some senior clerics considered Khamenei unqualified, but constitutional amendment sealed his elevation. This mattered institutionally because it shifted the source of supreme authority away from singular religious eminence and toward institutional control, revolutionary credentials, and alliance management. The office of leader became less dependent on charismatic jurisprudential superiority and more dependent on command over the state's supervisory and coercive mechanisms. In effect, succession moved from charismatic founding authority to bureaucratized guardianship. The revision also regularized crisis management. Article 111 laid out a temporary council to assume the leader's duties in the event of death, resignation, or dismissal, and Article 112 constitutionalized the Expediency Council as an advisory and arbitration organ appointed by the leader. The president's office became stronger administratively after the abolition of the prime ministership, but Article 113 still left it subordinate wherever the office of leadership was concerned. The consequence was a more coherent executive below and a more secure supervisory state above. This was the system Khamenei inherited in 1989, less charismatic than Khomeini's, but better suited to institutional accumulation. The next decades would show how effectively that revised structure allowed him to turn a contested succession into one of the most durable authoritarian orders in the Middle East. Ali Khamenei's central achievement was not merely survival in office, but the construction of a durable post-charismatic regime. He began from a position of relative weakness. Unlike Khomeini, he lacked unrivaled clerical stature, and his elevation depended on revision, elite support, and institutional circumstance rather than overwhelming religious authority. He therefore consolidated differently, by building up the office of the supreme leader, cultivating the Revolutionary Guards, relying on appointed jurists and judges, and expanding the reach of supervisory bodies. Article 110 gave him the tools. He appointed the clerical half of the Guardian Council, the head of the judiciary, the commanders of the guards, the top armed forces chiefs, the police command, and the head of state broadcasting. Over time, these appointments created a vertically integrated ecosystem in which the institutions most capable of filtering law, policing politics, and shaping information flowed upward to the leader rather than sideways to elected office. This did not abolish factional politics, it structured it. Khamenei presided over conservatives, hardliners, technocrats, pragmatic insiders, and reformists, but he did so as arbiter, not party chief. The office of the supreme leader allowed him to manage rival centers of influence without allowing any of them to become sovereign. The judiciary could discipline newspapers, activists, and politicians. State broadcasting could shape narratives of corruption, morality, national security, and foreign threat. The Guardian Council could narrow electoral fields. The Expediency Council could absorb disputes that ordinary legislative procedures could not settle. The consequence was a system in which elite competition remained real but bounded, producing circulation within the regime rather than alternation of regime type. This is why presidents from Rafsanjani to Khatami to Ahmadinejad to Rouhani to Raisi could differ sharply in style and coalition, yet never displace the supremacy of the leader's network. Khamenei also understood that clerical supervision alone could not sustain the state. He increasingly relied on institutions capable of coercion, financing, and crisis execution. That reliance was partly structural. A leader without Khomeini's charisma needed stronger organizational anchors. But it also had a lasting consequence for the regime. Authority migrated from the mosque-state ideal toward a clerical security hybrid in which military and intelligence institutions carried more of the regime's operational burden. Formal doctrine remained vilayat-e faqih. Effective rule increasingly depended on whether the leader could maintain alignment among the office, the guards, the judiciary, and the gatekeeping councils. In that sense, Khamenei did not merely inherit the post-1989 system. He hardened it. The most important beneficiary of that hardening was the Revolutionary Guards, whose rise became the defining structural change of the Islamic Republic after the war. The rise of the Revolutionary Guards from parallel military institution to politico-economic pillar is the clearest answer to the question of who really rules Iran. The IRGC was created after the revolution to defend the new order and answer directly to the supreme leader. Over time, it expanded far beyond military functions. CFR describes it as one of the most powerful organizations in Iran and notes that many former guards have moved into senior government roles. Reuters reports that Khamenei appointed former commanders to top posts, and that former guards in parliament generally support a hardline strategic agenda. This movement of personnel matters because it turns a coercive institution into a cadre system. Veterans circulate through ministries, provinces, parliament, strategic industries, and diplomatic security portfolios. The guards do not need to replace the state to dominate it. They can inhabit it. Their economic rise followed the same logic. During sanctions and reconstruction, the regime rewarded guard-linked firms with large contracts, especially through Khatam al-Anbiya, the IRGC's vast engineering arm. Reuters reported as early as 2015 that Khatam was developing sections of South Pars and receiving major infrastructure contracts, often in conditions where front firms and no-bid arrangements favored entities tied to the guards. This mattered for more than profit. Control over construction, logistics, ports, pipelines, telecommunications, procurement, and sanctions evasion created financial autonomy and patronage capacity. The guards could reward insiders, sustain veterans' networks, finance regional operations, and make themselves indispensable to any administration that needed projects delivered under isolation. Economic militarization thus reduced the leverage of ostensibly civilian institutions. Ministries might sign paperwork, but the actors capable of operating under sanctions increasingly belonged to the security sphere. By 2024, this process had reached a new stage in the oil sector. Reuters reported that the IRGC had tightened its grip on Tehran's oil industry, controlled up to half of exports, and expanded influence from shadow fleets and front companies to logistics and sales, especially to China. The guards' growing control over oil, still the main generator of foreign currency, gave them direct leverage over the state's revenue spine. It also strengthened their role in regional projection, because those revenues help fund the Quds force and allied networks across the Middle East. The contradiction is obvious. The regime's coercive guardian becomes a major economic actor, which distorts policy and entrenches sanctions-resistant interests. But the consequence is equally obvious. Continuity of the Islamic Republic increasingly serves not only an ideology, but an entrenched security patronage complex. Once that complex matured, electoral politics could continue, but only within boundaries the guards and the leader were prepared to tolerate. Managed electoral politics is the Islamic Republic's method of combining competition with containment. Elections matter because they distribute offices, shape factional balance, and provide a measure of public temperature. But they do not authorize an unrestricted struggle over the nature of the state. The Guardian Council, empowered to supervise elections and composed in a way that ties it back to the leader through both direct and indirect appointment, screens candidates before voters ever act. This gives the regime two advantages. First, it can limit the entry of figures likely to challenge the system's core institutions. Second, it can calibrate the electoral field to manage legitimacy, allowing more diversity when participation is needed and tighter exclusion when risk appears greater. The system is therefore neither electoral theater nor democracy. It is selective pluralism under clerical supervision. The reform era exposed both the possibility and the limits of this design. Mohammad Khatami's victories in 1997 and 2001 demonstrated that Iranian voters could rally behind demands for legal reform, civil society, and social opening. Yet the presidency's institutional weakness soon became apparent. Even after 1989, The president remained constitutionally subordinate to the office of leadership in all matters directly related to that office, while the Guardian Council, judiciary, security forces, and state media stayed beyond reformist control. The result was not simply conservative obstruction. It was a structural ceiling. The elected executive could signal public desire for change, but could not dislodge the unelected institutions that defined acceptable change. The Green Movement crisis of 2009 drove this lesson home. Once the regime treated electoral dispute as a security threat, the supervisory and coercive organs closed ranks around the leader. What followed was progressive narrowing. Reformists were marginalized, vetting grew harsher, and low-turnout elections became preferable to uncertain ones. By 2024, the pattern was unmistakable. The Guardian Council qualified only 144 clerics out of 510 who had registered for the Assembly of Experts and barred Hassan Rouhani. It also structured the parliamentary field through large-scale screening. In the presidential race, Pezeshkian was allowed to run and eventually won, but on historically low turnout. The contradiction is that the regime still needs elections to claim Republican legitimacy and channel elite rivalry, even as it fears their full political consequences. The consequence is a system that increasingly uses elections less to aggregate public will than to stage controlled selection among regime-compatible options. That logic became even more pronounced as sanctions, nuclear diplomacy, and recurrent unrest placed greater pressure on the state after 2010. Sanctions transformed the Islamic Republic's economy, but they did not simply weaken the regime, they reorganized it. Western restrictions on the oil sector and banking system after 2010 reduced ordinary economic capacity, increased inflationary and fiscal stress, and deepened social frustration. Yet they also rewarded actors able to operate in opacity. Security networks, front companies, politically protected traders, and parastatal bodies with access to confiscated assets, preferential contracts, and informal finance. By 2025, Reuters could describe a complex sanctions bypass ecosystem involving shell companies, aging tankers, ship-to-ship transfers, and deliberate disabling of vessel tracking systems. Oil exports recovered from their lows, reaching roughly 1.5 million barrels per day in 2024, with nearly 4/5 going to China. This was not economic normalization. It was sanction-adapted extraction under opaque control. The beneficiaries of this order were not distributed randomly. They included the Revolutionary Guards, whose smuggling capacity and front company networks became strategic assets, and institutions tied directly to the supreme leader. Reuters' investigation into Setad showed how Khamenei used the organization to build a holdings empire spanning banks, farms, industry, and seized property. Reuters found no evidence of personal enrichment in the narrow sense. Rather, Setad's assets underpinned political power. The U.S. Treasury later identified EIKO as owned or controlled by the supreme leader. More broadly, Boniads emerged after the revolution as semi-private Islamic conglomerates reporting directly to the leader and operating outside normal parliamentary oversight. The consequence was a patronage economy in which politically loyal, sanction-resilient institutions captured both wealth and distributive authority. Economic power thus reinforced the same supervisory hierarchy visible in the Constitution. This structure shaped nuclear diplomacy as well. The regime could bargain over sanctions relief, as in the 2015 nuclear deal, but never from a position in which reintegration threatened the interests of those who prospered in controlled isolation. Some guard-linked firms stood to gain from reopening. Others gained from opacity itself. The state therefore oscillated between negotiation and resistance, preserving what Iranian officials termed a resistance economy, while exploiting whatever openings diplomacy created. The contradiction is central to understanding modern Iran. Sanctions damage the country, but can stabilize the regime by enriching the institutions most committed to continuity. The consequence is that economic crisis does not automatically produce political liberalization. It often strengthens the actors best equipped to convert scarcity into controlled dependency. That dynamic fed directly into the protest cycles that followed. From 2017 onward, Iran entered an era of recurrent unrest in which protests were no longer confined to reformist urban constituencies or elite electoral disputes. Demonstrations over prices, fuel, wages, corruption, drought, regional inequality, and social restrictions spread across classes and provinces. The 2019 fuel price protests were especially important because they revealed how quickly the regime would fuse economic protest with national security doctrine. Reuters later reported that roughly 1,500 people were killed in the crackdown, and that the authorities imposed a nationwide internet shutdown for days, making it easier to conceal the scale of violence. This was a decisive institutional lesson. The regime demonstrated that it would use communications blackout, mass force, and broad detention not only to suppress mobilization, but to prevent the formation of a national political narrative against it. The coercive architecture behind this response was layered. The police handled initial order enforcement. The Basij provided decentralized street presence and ideological intimidation. The Revolutionary Guard supplied regime defense capacity. Intelligence organs mapped networks, and the judiciary translated repression into legal punishment. Reuters describes the Basij as the shock troops at the forefront of repressing unrest, notes their presence in enforcing social codes, and links them directly to the 2022 crackdown after Mahsa Amini's death. Internet restrictions recur because Iran is a global hotspot for blackouts, and Reuters reported that the 2022 shutdown helped hide abuses while damaging the economy. The consequence is that dissent in Iran is managed not by one institution but by a chain: surveillance, detention, selective violence, communications control, prosecution, and exemplary punishment. Each stage reinforces the others. The 2022 Woman, Life, Freedom movement pushed this system to its limits. Mahsa Amini's death in morality police custody turned mandatory hijab from a long-standing grievance into the focal point of a nationwide challenge to the regime's moral authority. Reuters notes that the protests became the biggest show of opposition in years. The judiciary then extended repression beyond the street. Protest-related executions continued, including in 2024, and legal cases were opened even against journalists released without hijab. The OHCHR fact-finding mission created in 2022 and extended in 2024 underscored how serious the international assessment had become. Yet the regime's institutional response was not retreat from coercion, but adaptation of it. By the time the immediate wave subsided, the Islamic Republic had preserved control, but at the cost of deeper legitimacy erosion, especially among women, youth, minorities, and urban constituencies. That erosion defines the post-2022 order. The post-2022 period through 2025 did not bring reconciliation between state and society. It produced a more tactical, uneven form of authoritarian adjustment. On one side, repression continued. Human Rights Watch reported in early 2025 that Iranian authorities were still targeting defenders, women, minorities, and families of those arrested or killed in the 2022 protests. Protest-related executions continued. Judicial harassment expanded. Surveillance technologies and prosecutions linked to dress code defiance persisted, and Reuters reported that authorities were using cameras in public places to identify and penalize unveiled women. The regime, therefore, did not abandon gender control. It tried to modernize enforcement, moving from morality patrol visibility toward distributed surveillance and legal pressure. On the other side, the state experimented with calibrated relaxation where direct confrontation seemed too risky. Reuters reported in November 2025 that women were visibly walking unveiled in Tehran, that visible social restrictions had eased in some spaces, and that Pezeshkian had refused to implement a hardline-backed hijab and chastity law approved the previous year. Yet Reuters also described this as part of a deliberate dual reality, softening visible restrictions to calm public opinion while intensifying the crackdown on political dissent. This is a crucial institutional development. It shows that by 2025 the regime increasingly distinguished between symbolic social control and core political control. It could tolerate partial noncompliance in public morality where enforcement was too costly, but it remained unwilling to relax the security, judicial, and informational tools that protect the system from organized opposition. The result was not liberalization but strategic triumph. Urban Iran, especially Tehran, displayed open signs of social change. Provincial and poorer constituencies remained more exposed to basage, patronage, and local enforcement networks. Political organizing across all regions remained dangerous. The regime's doctrine and social reality diverged more sharply than at any point since 1979. Women and young people openly breached norms that the constitutionally Islamic State claimed to embody, while the state preserved its authority by criminalizing political challenge rather than restoring full moral compliance. The contradiction is severe. A republic founded on Islamic guardianship can no longer reliably impose all of its social code in the capital, yet it still crushes political dissent with force. The consequence is a legitimacy crisis that is no longer episodic. It is structural, and it feeds directly into the regime's external behavior and succession calculus. Foreign policy in the Islamic Republic is not an external supplement to domestic rule. It is a domestic regime security instrument. The Constitution gives the leader command over war and peace, while Article 176 assigns the Supreme National Security Council responsibility for defense and national security policy within the framework determined by the leader. The Revolutionary Guards, especially the Quds Force, turned this architecture into a regional system. Money, training, weapons, and doctrine flowed to Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, Iraqi militias, and Syrian partners. Reuters' description of the axis of resistance captures the design. Tehran built a network intended to project influence, deter adversaries, and keep conflicts away from Iranian territory while tying regional theaters to the regime's own strategic depth. Proxy strategy, in other words, was also a method of domestic insurance. By 2024 to 2025, however, that external architecture was under heavy strain. Reuters recorded the shift from shadow war to direct confrontation in 2024, including Iran's April missile and drone barrage against Israel and the cycle of retaliation that followed. In late 2024, the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria was described by Reuters as a major blow to Russia and Iran. Reuters also reported in 2024 that the IRGC's oil revenues helped fund proxies across the Middle East, underlining the financial connection between domestic extraction and regional projection. By November 2025, Reuters was describing a regime whose regional network had been badly damaged and whose military and nuclear sites had suffered from conflict with Israel in June. The contradiction is severe. The regional strategy that once reinforced deterrence and revolutionary prestige increasingly imposed fiscal, military, and political costs on a society already exhausted by sanctions and repression. Yet, even weakened, foreign policy remains central to who rules Iran, because the institutions that manage external confrontation are the same ones central to domestic survival: the leader, the guards, the Supreme National Security Council, the intelligence apparatus, and the judiciary when national security law is invoked. Presidents can adjust tone, pursue diplomacy, or resist implementing certain moral laws, but they do not command the core strategic instruments. The external dimension therefore reinforces the central thesis of the regime. Iran is not ruled simply by clerics, nor simply by generals, nor simply by elected officials. It is ruled by their organized interaction under an unelected apex. By 2025, that apex was under greater stress than at any time since 1989, which is why the question of succession became the final test of the system's design. By the end of 2025, the Islamic Republic remains operationally intact, but strategically narrowed. Its strengths are still formidable. It possesses a constitution that embeds unelected supremacy inside republican forms, a leader's office that can appoint, arbitrate, and supervise, a guardian council that filters entry into politics, a judiciary that can criminalize dissent, a basage and police network capable of decentralized coercion, a revolutionary guards establishment that spans domestic security, regional operations, and major revenue channels, and parastatal economic institutions tied to the leader that distribute rents. Outside normal parliamentary accountability, these are not improvised tools. They are mutually reinforcing pillars. They help explain why repeated crises, war, sanctions, reformist surges, the 2009 Green Movement, the 2019 fuel protests, and the 2022 uprising have weakened the regime without yet dislodging it. Its vulnerabilities, however, are equally structural. First, succession is dangerous because the system's apex is singular even though the regime beneath it is plural. The assembly of experts formally chooses the leader, but the real process depends on alignment among clerical, security, and patronage institutions. Raisi's death in 2024 complicated that problem by removing a plausible successor. Reuters reporting on Mojtaba Khamenei's unelected but influential role inside his father's office illustrates the broader reality. Succession is no longer only a question of clerical rank, but of who can command trust across the office, the guards, and the conservative establishment. Second, legitimacy has decayed faster than coercive capacity. Low turnout, persistent repression, open social noncompliance, and widening distance between doctrine and lived urban reality all indicate that the regime governs more through control than consent. Third, the growing weight of the guards in oil, smuggling, and strategy increases the risk that future leadership will depend even more heavily on military security interests. The final answer, then, is precise. Iran is neither a normal republic nor a simple personal dictatorship. The supreme leader is the constitutional apex and the indispensable node of command, appointment, and arbitration. But he rules effectively only through a coalition of unelected supervisory organs, the office of the supreme leader, the judiciary, and above all, the Revolutionary Guards and associated patronage networks. Elections exist, but inside a vetted field. Parliament legislates, but under review. Presidents govern, but below the office of leadership. The assembly of experts appoints, but from inside a filtered clerical universe. Real power lies in the interaction between clerical supremacy, controlled legality, coercive enforcement, and rent distribution. In 1979, the Islamic Republic set out to fuse religion and state. By 2025, it functions, more exactly, as a clerical security order that preserves republican procedure where useful, deploys legality where convenient, and relies on coercive and economic institutions to ensure that the center of power remains beyond the reach of voters.